Sometimes the most brilliant minds sleep on park benches, invisible to a world that measures worth by bank accounts and business suits. In the desert heat of a prestigious air show, tech CEO Celeste Keating's revolutionary hydrogen electric jet sits dead on the tarmac, despite the efforts of 25 elite engineers. Her million-dollar prototype refuses to start, embarrassing her in front of thousands of spectators and live-stream viewers. Frustrated and desperate, she spots a homeless man watching from beyond the security fence and mocks him on live television. "Call yourself a mechanic? Start my plane." That forgotten stranger is Gabe Skylark Morales, a former Air Force crew chief whose genius once kept fighter jets soaring, but whose life fell apart through medical bills and invisible wounds. When he accepts her challenge, everything changes. What happens next will prove that sometimes the greatest solutions come from the most unlikely places. But can a man's society threw away show them what they've been missing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Mojave Desert as Gabriel Skylark Morales shifted his weight against the chain-link fence, watching the sleek aircraft gleam like a silver promise on the distant tarmac. His weathered hands gripped the worn handle of his father's toolbox, a battered metal case that had once held the precision instruments of a master aircraft mechanic, but now contained only the essentials: a few screwdrivers, wire strippers, and electrical tape. The box was all he had left of the man who taught him that every machine had a heartbeat, every engine had a soul, and every problem had a solution if you listened carefully enough. 3 years ago, Gabe had been Staff Sergeant Gabriel Morales, crew chief for the 58th Fighter Squadron at Nellis Air Force Base. His hands had been steady then, his mind sharp as a razor's edge, his reputation spotless. Pilots trusted him with their lives, and he'd never let them down. The F-16s under his care had maintained a perfect maintenance record for 18 months straight, a feat that earned him commendations and the respect of officers twice his rank. His photographic memory for aircraft schematics was legendary. He could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, and had an intuitive understanding of hydraulics that made seasoned engineers shake their heads in amazement. But that was before the convoy in Afghanistan, before the roadside bomb that sent shrapnel through his left leg and invisible wounds deeper into his soul. The physical therapy had been manageable, but the medical bills had mounted like storm clouds. His wife Sarah had tried to hold everything together, working double shifts at the hospital while he recovered, but the financial pressure had been relentless. When the PTSD symptoms started, the sleepless nights, the flashbacks that made him freeze up during routine maintenance procedures, everything began to unravel. The Air Force Medical Board had been understanding but firm, early retirement with partial benefits. Sarah had stayed for another year, but watching him struggle with crowds, with loud noises, with the very aircraft that had once been his passion, had slowly worn her down. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, along with the final notice on their mortgage. By Thursday, Gabe was living in his truck. By winter, even that was gone. Now he survived on the margins, picking up odd jobs when his nerves allowed, sleeping in shelters when space was available, and finding solace in the open desert where the silence helped quiet the chaos in his head. The airshow was a dangerous pleasure. Being this close to aircraft again stirred memories both beautiful and painful, but he couldn't stay away. These machines still called to him, still sang their mechanical songs that only he seemed to hear. On the other side of the fence, Celeste Keating stood in the climate-controlled comfort of her private viewing pavilion, watching her engineering team swarm around the silent wing prototype like antibodies attacking an infection. At 48, she was the youngest CEO in the history of Keating Aerospace, a position she'd earned through a combination of brilliant engineering insight and ruthless business acumen. Her hydrogen-electric hybrid propulsion system represented 5 years of development and $300 million in investment. Today's demonstration was supposed to be her company's crowning achievement, a flight that would revolutionize business aviation and cement her legacy as an industry visionary. The prototype was beautiful, she had to admit, sleek as a raptor, with swept wings that seemed to cut through the air even while stationary. The hydrogen fuel cells were integrated seamlessly into the design, promising zero-emission flight with the performance of traditional jet engines. The electric motors could provide whisper-quiet operation for airport approaches, while the hydrogen turbines delivered the power needed for transcontinental range. It was everything the aviation industry claimed to want: clean, efficient, and profitable. But for the past 45 minutes, it had been nothing more than an expensive sculpture. "Talk to me, Marcus," Celeste called to her chief engineer, a brilliant MIT graduate who'd helped design the propulsion system. Marcus Chen wiped sweat from his forehead despite the morning chill, his usually composed demeanor cracking under the pressure. "We've run full diagnostics 3 times, he reported, his voice tight with frustration. "All systems show green. Fuel cells are charged, electrical systems are nominal, turbines are clear. But when we initiate the startup sequence, nothing happens. It's like the computer doesn't recognize the command." Celeste felt her carefully constructed confidence begin to erode. The press was already asking questions, investors were checking their phones with increasing frequency, and the live stream audience was growing restless. Aviation Week had sent their top reporter, and rumors were already circulating on social media about delays and technical problems. "What about the backup systems?" she asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. "Same result. We've tried manual override, direct electrical connection, even bypassing the main computer entirely. The engines just won't respond." Behind Marcus, a small army of technicians continued their frantic work. Test pilots, who'd flown everything from experimental aircraft to space shuttles, stood helplessly by, their expertise useless without a functioning machine. Software engineers hunched over laptops, running code diagnostics that revealed nothing. Even the representatives from the engine manufacturer looked bewildered, their confidence in their own systems beginning to waver. The media area buzzed with speculation. Aviation journalists who'd covered decades of air shows exchanged theories about everything from sabotage to fundamental design flaws. The live stream chat was becoming increasingly harsh, with viewers questioning whether Keating Aerospace had oversold their capabilities. Stock prices, Celeste knew, would be falling with each passing minute. She thought about her father, who'd built this company from nothing after returning from Vietnam. He'd started with a single hangar and a dream of making aviation safer, cleaner, more accessible. His innovations in avionics had saved countless lives, and his reputation for integrity had been the foundation of everything they'd built. What would he think of this spectacle? Of his daughter's moment of triumph turning into a public humiliation? The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her entire career fighting to be taken seriously in a male-dominated industry, proving again and again that she belonged in boardrooms and design labs. Now, when she needed it most, all that proving seemed meaningless. The prototype that was supposed to validate her vision sat silent, mocking her ambitions with its stubborn refusal to cooperate. "Ma'am," called James Walsh, her head of security, a former military police officer whose calm professionalism had been invaluable during the stressful months of development. "We've got media requests for comments. How do you want to handle this?" Celeste looked out at the crowd, at the cameras, at the expectant faces of investors and colleagues. She'd faced hostile takeover attempts, patent disputes, and regulatory challenges. She'd navigated the treacherous waters of government contracts and international negotiations. But this felt different. This felt personal. "Give me 5 more minutes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Then I'll make a statement." As James nodded and walked away, Celeste found herself looking beyond the immediate crisis to the fence line, where a small crowd of spectators had gathered. Most were aviation enthusiasts, retirees who'd worked in the industry, families enjoying a day out. But one figure caught her attention, a man in worn jeans and a faded military jacket, standing slightly apart from the others, his attention focused not on the crowd or the media circus, but on the aircraft itself. There was something about his posture, the way he tilted his head, as if listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Even from this distance, she could see the intensity of his focus, the way his eyes moved systematically across the prototype systems. He held a battered toolbox in one hand, and something about his bearing suggested military experience. For a moment, she found herself wondering what he was thinking, what he might be seeing that her team of experts had missed. Then she dismissed the thought as desperation clouding her judgment. The solution to this crisis would come from her engineers, her systems, her careful planning, not from some stranger watching from the sidelines. But as the minutes ticked by and the start-up attempts continued to fail, Celeste found her gaze returning to the fence line, to the quiet figure who seemed to understand something the rest of them had forgotten. In the growing heat of the morning sun, with her reputation crumbling and her future uncertain, she began to wonder if perhaps the answer she needed might come from the most unexpected place of all. The breaking point came at 10:47 a.m., when the third startup attempt failed with the same electronic silence that had plagued the previous two. Celeste watched her chief engineer's shoulders slump in defeat, saw the worried glances between her board members, and felt the weight of $300 million in investment pressing down on her like a physical force. The live stream viewer count had climbed to over 50,000, and she could imagine the comments flooding in everything from technical speculation to outright mockery. "Ladies and gentlemen," she heard herself saying into the wireless microphone clipped to her blazer, her voice carrying across the tarmac and into the homes of viewers around the world. "We're experiencing a minor technical delay with our demonstration this morning. Our engineering team is working to resolve the issue, and we'll have the silent wing airborne shortly." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they rang hollow. This wasn't a minor delay, this was a catastrophic failure at the worst possible moment. The aviation industry was watching, competitors were undoubtedly celebrating, and her company's stock price was probably in free fall. That's when she saw him again, the man by the fence, still watching with that same intense focus. Something about his calm presence in the midst of the chaos irritated her. While her world was crumbling, he stood there like a casual observer at a sporting event, probably enjoying the spectacle of her failure. The unfairness of it, all the years of work, the sacrifices, the battles fought, and one suddenly crystallized into anger at this stranger who seemed to embody everything she was fighting against. Without thinking, she strode toward the fence line, her heels clicking on the asphalt, the wireless microphone still live and broadcasting her every word. The crowd of spectators parted as she approached, some recognizing her from the morning's presentations, others simply sensing the authority in her bearing. "You," she called out, pointing directly at Gabe, "you've been watching this whole time. What do you think? Got any brilliant insights from the peanut gallery?" Gabe looked up, startled by the direct confrontation. He'd been lost in thought, mentally tracing the aircraft systems, listening to the subtle sounds that might reveal the source of the problem. Now he found himself face to face with Celeste Keating herself, her expression a mixture of frustration and challenge. "I wasn't," he began, but she cut him off. "No, please, share your expertise. You've been studying my aircraft for the past hour. Surely you've solved all our problems by now." The sarcasm in her voice was sharp enough to cut glass, and she could see the hurt in his eyes. But she was beyond caring about politeness. Her career was dissolving in real time, and she needed someone to blame. "Call yourself a mechanic, start my plane." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a medieval joust. Around them, the crowd fell silent, smartphones turning toward the confrontation. The live stream audience suddenly had something more interesting than a broken aircraft to watch a public humiliation unfolding in real time. Gabe felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the old anxiety that came with being the center of attention. But there was something else too, a stirring of the pride he'd thought was dead, the professional instinct that had never quite left him despite everything that had happened. He looked at the aircraft, then back at Celeste, and made a decision that would change both their lives. "I'll need to see the diagnostic reports," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And I'll need access to the aircraft." Celeste blinked, caught off guard by his calm response. She'd expected embarrassment, maybe anger, certainly not this measured professionalism. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." Gabe shifted his toolbox to his other hand, the familiar weight of it grounding him. "But I have one condition." "A condition?" Celeste's voice rose in disbelief. "You're in no position to make conditions. If I get your aircraft running, you acknowledge me as part of your team. Publicly. On record. Not as some charity case or publicity stunt, but as a contributing member of your engineering effort." The request was so unexpected, so far from what she'd anticipated, that Celeste found herself momentarily speechless. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. The live stream chat was exploding with commentary, and she could see phones recording every word. "This is insane," she muttered. But even as she said it, she was calculating the odds. Her team had exhausted every conventional approach. Stock prices were falling. Investors were asking uncomfortable questions. What did she have to lose? "Fine," she said, the word coming out harsher than she intended. "But when you fail, and you will fail, I want you to admit it publicly. No excuses, no blame, shifting. You tell everyone that you were wrong." Gabe nodded. "Fair enough. But I'll need that waiver in writing, and I'll need your head of security to witness it." Within minutes, James Walsh had produced a hastily drafted document on official Keating Aerospace letterhead. The waiver was simple but comprehensive. Gabriel Morales would be granted temporary access to the Silent Wing prototype for diagnostic and repair purposes, with the understanding that any damage or injury would be his responsibility. In exchange, if he successfully resolved the startup issue, he would be credited as a consulting engineer on the project. As Gabe signed the document with a borrowed pen, his hand trembling slightly, he thought about all the aircraft he'd worked on, all the problems he'd solved, all the lives he'd helped save. This might be his last chance to prove that he was more than just a casualty of circumstances beyond his control. The security gate clicked open, and Gabe stepped onto the tarmac for the first time in 3 years. The familiar smells hit him immediately. Jet fuel, hot metal, the ozone scent of electrical systems. For a moment, the anxiety threatened to overwhelm him, memories of his last day in uniform flooding back. But then he focused on the aircraft ahead of him, on the challenge that awaited, and the panic receded. The Silent Wing was even more impressive up close. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every line and curve optimized for both performance and efficiency. The hydrogen fuel cells were seamlessly integrated into the wing structure, and the electric motors were so quiet he could barely hear them running. This was engineering at its finest, the kind of innovation that could genuinely change the world, which made its failure all the more puzzling. As he approached the aircraft, Gabe was aware of the crowd watching, of the cameras recording, of the weight of expectation and skepticism pressing down on him. But gradually, all of that faded away. There was only the machine, the problem, and the quiet voice of his father echoing in his memory. "Every machine has a heartbeat, son. You just have to learn how to listen." Gabe set down his toolbox and began to listen. The borrowed multimeter felt foreign in Gabe's hands, at first a cheap digital model that lacked the precision of the military-grade instruments he'd once used. But as he powered it on and began running basic electrical tests, muscle memory took over. His movements became smoother, more confident, the shaking in his hands gradually subsiding as he fell into the familiar rhythm of systematic diagnosis. "What exactly are you doing?" Marcus Chen asked, hovering at Gabe's shoulder with barely concealed skepticism. The chief engineer had spent the last hour running sophisticated computer diagnostics, and now he was watching a homeless man probe circuits with a $20 multimeter from Radio Shack. "Starting at the beginning," Gabe replied, his attention focused on the voltage readings. "Your computer systems are showing green across the board, which means either the sensors are lying or the problem is downstream from where they're looking." He moved methodically through the aircraft's electrical systems, checking power supplies, testing connections, verifying that the actual voltages matched what the computers reported. It was tedious work, the kind of step-by-step troubleshooting that modern avionics systems were supposed to eliminate. But Gabe had learned long ago that computers could be wrong, sensors could fail, and sometimes the only way to find the truth was to verify everything manually. "The fuel cell output is perfect," he announced after 15 minutes of testing. "Steady 270 volts, clean power, no fluctuations. The electrical distribution system is working exactly as designed." Marcus frowned. "We already know that. The problem isn't with power generation, it's with the startup sequence. The engines aren't responding to the ignition commands." "Are you sure about that?" Gabe asked, already moving toward the engine compartment. "Because power generation and ignition systems are more connected than you might think, especially in a hybrid design like this." As he worked, Gabe's mind drifted back to his early days in the Air Force, when he'd been a young airman fresh out of technical school. His first crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, had been a 20-year veteran who'd seen every type of aircraft malfunction imaginable. Rodriguez had taught him that the most dangerous assumption in aircraft maintenance was that you knew what the problem was before you'd proven it. "Never trust the computer until you've verified it with your own eyes," Rodriguez had said during one particularly frustrating troubleshooting session. "Computers are smart, but they're not wise. They can tell you what they're programmed to see, but they can't think outside their parameters." Now, as Gabe traced the electrical pathways through the Silent Wing's complex systems, he could hear Rodriguez's voice as clearly as if the old sergeant was standing beside him. The aircraft's design was brilliant, but it was also incredibly complex. Every system was interconnected, every component dependent on dozens of others. A failure in one area could cascade through the entire network in ways that weren't immediately obvious. "The ignition system is getting power," he announced, his multimeter probe touching a connection deep in the engine compartment. "But the signal timing is off. It's like the computer is sending the ignition command, but it's arriving at the wrong moment." "That's impossible," Marcus said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "We've tested the timing algorithms hundreds of times. The ignition sequence is hard-coded into the system." Gabe looked up from his work, studying the young engineer's face. Marcus was brilliant, no question about it, but he was also young enough to still believe that complex systems always worked as designed. Gabe had learned the hard way that reality was messier than theory. "Tell me about the environmental sensors," Gabe said. "How does the system compensate for temperature and humidity?" "Standard atmospheric compensation," Marcus replied. "The computer adjusts fuel mixture and ignition timing based on ambient conditions. It's fully automatic. Pilot doesn't need to worry about it." "What about extreme conditions? What if the humidity is outside normal parameters?" Marcus hesitated. "The system is designed to handle any reasonable atmospheric conditions. We tested it in climate chambers, simulated everything from Arctic cold to tropical heat. But did you test it in the desert? At this altitude, in this specific combination of temperature and humidity?" The question hung in the air, and Gabe could see the doubt beginning to creep into Marcus's expression. The Mojave Desert was notorious for its extreme conditions, scorching heat, bone-dry air, and sudden temperature fluctuations that could play havoc with sensitive electronics. "The environmental sensors are reading normal," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "According to the computer," Gabe agreed. "But what if the computer is wrong? What if it's trying to compensate for conditions that don't actually exist?" He continued his methodical testing, checking connections, verifying voltages, following the electrical pathways through the aircraft's nervous system. The crowd had grown restless, some people wandering away to explore other exhibits, but the core group remained, watching with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. The live-stream audience was more engaged than ever, the chat filled with everything from technical speculation to betting pools on whether the homeless mechanic would succeed. Aviation forums were exploding with debate about the failure, and Start My Plane was trending on social media. Celeste watched from her pavilion, her emotions a complicated mix of hope and dread. Part of her wanted Gabe to succeed, to prove that her faith in him hadn't been misplaced. But another part feared what success might mean, that her team of experts had been shown up by a man with a $20 multimeter and a battered toolbox. "The fuel injection system is working perfectly," Gabe announced after another 10 minutes of testing. "Pressure is steady, flow rates are correct, atomization is optimal, the hydrogen is getting to the combustion chamber exactly as it should." "Then why won't it ignite?" Marcus asked, his frustration evident. Gabe paused, considering the question. In his mind, he was building a map of the aircraft systems, tracing the flow of fuel, air, and electrical signals through the complex network of components. Somewhere in that maze was the answer, the single point of failure that was preventing the engines from starting. "Because something is telling the computer that the conditions aren't right for ignition," he said finally. "The question is what and why." He moved to the environmental sensor cluster, a sophisticated array of devices that monitored everything from air temperature to barometric pressure. The readings all looked normal on the display, but Gabe had learned not to trust displays. "I need to test these sensors directly," he said, disconnecting the first probe. "If one of them is sending bad data, it could be affecting the entire startup sequence." As he worked, Gabe found himself thinking about the irony of the situation. Here he was, a man who'd lost everything because of medical bills and invisible wounds, troubleshooting a $300 million aircraft while the world watched. 3 years ago, he'd been respected, valued, essential. Now he was fighting for the chance to prove he was more than just a casualty. But the aircraft didn't care about his personal history. It only cared about facts, about electrical signals and mechanical tolerances, about the immutable laws of physics that governed flight. And in that clarity, Gabe found a kind of peace he hadn't experienced in years. "There," he said, his multimeter beeping as it registered an anomaly. "The humidity sensor is reading 15% higher than actual conditions. The computer thinks the air is too moist for optimal combustion, so it's delaying ignition until the conditions improve." Marcus leaned over to look at the reading, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement. "But that sensor was calibrated just last week. How is it possible?" "Desert conditions," Gabe explained, already reaching for his toolbox. "The extreme temperature differential between day and night, combined with the alkaline dust in the air, can affect sensor accuracy over time. It's a known issue with this type of ceramic humidity sensor." As he spoke, Gabe was already formulating a solution. The fix would require more than just recalibrating the sensor. It would need a complete rewrite of the environmental compensation algorithms. But first, he needed to prove his theory was correct. "I need something to clean the sensor housing," he said, looking around at the assembled engineers. "Something that won't leave residue or conduct electricity." One of the younger technicians offered a small bottle of electronics cleaner, but Gabe shook his head. "Too harsh. It might damage the ceramic element." That's when he remembered the roll of dental floss in his jacket pocketer habit, left over from his military days, when personal hygiene had been a matter of discipline and pride. The floss was unwaxed, made of strong nylon that wouldn't break under stress. "This might work," he said, pulling out the small container. Around him, the engineering team exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to amusement. But Gabe was already focused on the task at hand, using the dental floss to carefully clean the sensor housing in ways that conventional tools couldn't reach. Sometimes the best solutions, he reflected, came from the most unexpected sources. The sight of a homeless man cleaning precision aircraft sensors with dental floss was enough to send ripples of disbelief through the crowd. Some spectators pulled out their phones to record the surreal moment, while others simply shook their heads in amazement. The livestream chat exploded with commentary ranging from admiration to outright ridicule. "He's actually using dental floss," someone called out from the crowd, their voice carrying a mixture of wonder and skepticism. Gabe ignored the comments, his attention focused entirely on the delicate work before him. The ceramic humidity sensor was incredibly sensitive, its molecular structure designed to react to microscopic changes in atmospheric moisture. Desert dust, no matter how fine, could create a film that interfered with its accuracy. The dental floss, with its smooth nylon surface and precise thickness, was actually an ideal tool for reaching into the sensor's microscopic channels. "This is insane," Marcus muttered, but he was watching intently as Gabe worked with the careful precision of a surgeon. Even if the sensor is dirty, the computer should be able to compensate for minor variations. "Not if the error is large enough," Gabe replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Your environmental algorithms probably have acceptable variance parameter, say, plus or minus 5%. But if the sensor is reading 15% high, that's outside the compensation range." As he worked, Gabe's mind was already racing ahead to the next challenge. Cleaning the sensor might solve the immediate problem, but it wouldn't address the underlying issue. The aircraft's environmental compensation algorithms were too rigid, too dependent on perfect sensor data. In the real world, sensors failed, conditions changed, and systems had to adapt. "There," he said, carefully reassembling the sensor housing. "Let's see if that makes a difference." Marcus activated the aircraft's diagnostic systems, and for the first time in over an hour, the readings changed. The humidity sensor now showed levels consistent with the actual desert conditions, bone dry, with barely 5% moisture in the air. "I don't believe it," Marcus breathed, staring at the display. "The combustion parameters are shifting into the optimal range." But Gabe was already shaking his head. "The sensor's clean now, but that's just treating the symptom. The real problem is in the software. Your algorithms are too inflexible. They can't handle unexpected conditions." "What do you mean?" Celeste asked, appearing at his shoulder. She'd been watching from a distance, but the change in the readings had drawn her closer. "The computer is programmed to wait for perfect conditions before initiating ignition," Gabe explained. "But perfect conditions don't exist in the real world. Weather changes, sensors drift, components age. The system needs to be able to adapt." He paused, studying the displays that showed the aircraft's various systems. The fuel cells were charged, the electrical systems were functioning, and the environmental readings were now accurate. But the startup sequence was still locked in a waiting pattern, refusing to proceed because the conditions weren't quite what the programmers had expected. "I need to modify the ignition algorithms," he said. "Make them more flexible, more tolerant of real-world variations." "You want to reprogram our flight control software?" Marcus asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "That code took months to develop and test. It's certified by the FAA. You can't just—" "I can make a temporary patch," Gabe interrupted. "Something that will allow the startup sequence to proceed with current conditions. It won't affect the certified codate. It'll just override the environmental restrictions for this demonstration." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Modifying flight control software was serious business, the kind of work that usually required teams of programmers and months of testing. But they didn't have months. They had an audience of 50,000 viewers and a reputation crumbling in real time. "What would you need?" Celeste asked, her voice carefully neutral. "A device that can connect to the aircraft's diagnostic port," Gabe replied. "Something with enough processing power to run a code editor. A laptop would be ideal, but even a smartphone might work." One of the younger engineers, a recent graduate named Sarah Kim, stepped forward. "I've got my phone," she said, holding up a high-end smartphone. "It's got a pretty powerful processor, and I've got a coding app installed." Gabe smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. "That might just work, but I'll need an adapter to connect it to the diagnostic port." Within minutes, the engineering team had produced a collection of cables, adapters, and connectors that would allow the smartphone to communicate with the aircraft's computers. It was an improvised solution, the kind of field engineering that would have horrified the manufacturers, but was exactly what the situation required. As Gabe connected the phone to the aircraft's diagnostic system, he found himself thinking about his father again. Eduardo Morales had been a master of improvisation, able to repair complex machinery with whatever materials were available. During the lean years after returning from Vietnam, he'd kept a small airport's fleet running with creativity, determination, and an intuitive understanding of how machines really worked. "Every problem has a solution," Eduardo had always said. "Sometimes it's not the solution you expect, but it's always there if you're willing to look for it." Now, as Gabe began typing code on the smartphone's small screen, he felt his father's presence like a guiding hand. The programming language was modern, but the underlying principles were the same as they'd always been: input, processing, output, and the logical flow that connected them all. "What exactly are you doing?" Marcus asked, watching lines of code scroll across the phone's display. "Creating a bypass routine," Gabe explained, his fingers moving with surprising speed across the touchscreen. "The current algorithm waits for all environmental parameters to fall within optimal ranges before proceeding. I'm writing a new routine that will allow ignition if the parameters are merely adequate." The code was elegant in its simplicity, a series of conditional statements that would override the aircraft's conservative startup restrictions. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, the engines would start as long as the basic safety requirements were met. "This is brilliant," Sarah Kim said, reading over his shoulder. "The logic is completely sound. Why didn't we think of this?" "Because you were solving a different problem," Gabe replied. "You were designing a system for perfect conditions, for controlled environments where everything works as expected, but real-world aviation is messier than that." As he worked, Gabe was vaguely aware of the crowd around him, of the cameras recording his every move, of the weight of expectation pressing down on him. But the programming demanded his complete attention, each line of code building on the last, creating a digital pathway around the obstacles that had stymied the aircraft. The photographic memory that had served him so well in the Air Force was working overtime now, recalling details from technical manuals he'd read years ago, remembering the subtle interactions between different aircraft systems. The silent wing was more advanced than anything he'd worked on before, but the fundamental principles remained the same. "Done," he announced, saving the code to the phone's memory. "Now I need to upload this to the aircraft's computer and test it." The upload process was nerve-wracking, with potential for disaster at every step. If the code was wrong, if there was a logic error or a syntax mistake, it could lock up the entire system. But Gabe had checked and double-checked every line, and he was confident in the solution. "Upload complete," he said, disconnecting the phone from the diagnostic port. "The new routine is loaded and ready to test." Marcus moved to the startup controls, his hand hovering over the ignition switch. "Are you sure about this? If something goes wrong?" "Then I take full responsibility," Gabe replied. "But I'm betting it works." The moment of truth had arrived. After nearly 2 hours of troubleshooting, of cleaning sensors and rewriting code, everything came down to this single switch. Gabe felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the anxiety that had plagued him since Afghanistan. But underneath it was something else, quiet confidence, born of years of experience and a deep understanding of how machines really worked. "Hit it," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Marcus pressed the switch, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a soft whir that built to a whistle and finally to a roar, the silent wing's engines came to life. The roar of the hydrogen-electric engines was unlike anything Gabe had heard before, a deep, powerful sound that seemed to combine the best characteristics of both technologies. The hydrogen turbines provided the raw power, while the electric motors added their own whisper-quiet efficiency. Together, they created a symphony of engineering that sent shivers down his spine. Around him, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The live-stream viewer count had climbed to over 100,000, and the chat was moving too fast to read. Aviation journalists were frantically updating their stories, and social media was exploding with videos of the moment the engines came to life. But Gabe barely noticed the celebration. His attention was focused on the smartphone in his hands, which was now displaying the aircraft's real-time diagnostic data. The code he'd written was working perfectly, allowing the engines to start despite the less than optimal environmental conditions. But as he studied the readouts, he began to notice something troubling. "The fuel consumption is higher than expected," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "About 12% above the design specifications." Marcus, who had been basking in the glow of success, immediately turned his attention to the displays. "That's within acceptable parameters for a prototype," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "No," Gabe replied, his fingers flying across the phone's screen as he accessed deeper levels of the diagnostic system. "This isn't normal variation. There's something else going on." As he worked, Gabe found himself thinking about the countless hours he'd spent in aircraft hangars, learning to read the subtle signs that machines gave when something wasn't quite right. His father had taught him that every aircraft had its own personality, its own way of communicating with those who knew how to listen. "The hydrogen flow rates are fluctuating," he announced, his voice tight with concern. "Small variations, but they're outside the normal range. It's like the system is fighting itself." Sarah Kim, the young engineer who had provided her smartphone, moved closer to look at the data. "Could it be related to the code modification you made?" "No," Gabe said, shaking his head. "The bypass routine only affects the startup sequence. Once the engines are running, the normal fuel management systems take over." But even as he said it, Gabe was beginning to suspect that the problem ran deeper than anyone had realized. The humidity sensor malfunction hadn't been an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a larger issue with the aircraft's environmental compensation systems. "I need to check the fuel system calibration," he said, already moving toward the aircraft's fuel cell compartment. "If the sensors are giving bad data, it could be affecting more than just the startup sequence." As he worked, Gabe was aware of Celeste watching him with a mixture of gratitude and concern. The engines were running, which meant the demonstration could proceed, but the fuel consumption issue was a serious problem that could affect the aircraft's performance and safety. "How long have you been working on this project?" Gabe asked Marcus, as he checked the fuel cell connections. "About 18 months, Marcus replied. "We started with the basic propulsion concept and built everything around it. And the environmental compensation algorithms. Those were developed by a subcontractor," Marcus said, and Gabe caught something in his tone, subtle hesitation that suggested there might be more to the story. "Which subcontractor?" Gabe asked, his attention still focused on the fuel system diagnostics. "Apex Aviation Systems," Marcus replied. "They specialize in avionics software. They've done work for most of the major aircraft manufacturers." Gabe frowned. He'd heard of Apex. They had a reputation for producing functional but uninspired code, the kind of software that met specifications but lacked the elegance and robustness of truly excellent engineering. More importantly, they had a reputation for cutting corners to meet deadlines and budgets. "The fuel mixture algorithms are definitely wrong," he announced after several minutes of testing. "The system is overcompensating for humidity variations, which is causing the excessive fuel consumption." "But the aircraft is flying within acceptable parameters," Marcus protested. "The performance is still within the design envelope." "For now," Gabe agreed. "But what happens when you encounter real weather? What happens when you're flying through a storm, or dealing with rapid altitude changes, or operating in extreme temperatures?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The silent wing had been designed for the controlled environment of test flights and demonstrations. But real-world aviation was far more demanding. Airlines operated in all weather conditions, at all altitudes, in every corner of the globe. The aircraft systems had to be robust enough to handle whatever nature threw at them. "The environmental compensation code needs to be completely rewritten," Gabe said, his voice carrying the weight of professional judgment. "The current algorithms are too rigid, too dependent on perfect sensor data. In the real world, that's a recipe for disaster." As he spoke, Gabe found himself thinking about his own journey from military precision to civilian chaos. The Air Force had taught him to expect the unexpected, to plan for failures, and have backup systems for the backup systems. But civilian aviation often operated under different constraints, with tighter budgets and shorter development timelines. "What would it take to fix the problem?" Celeste asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Time, money, and a lot of very careful programming," Gabe replied. "The good news is that the hardware is sound. Your fuel cells, your electric motors, your hydrogen turbines are all working perfectly. The problem is purely software." He paused, studying the diagnostic displays on the smartphone. The engines were still running smoothly, but the fuel consumption data was painting a troubling picture. If the aircraft were to attempt a long-distance flight with these inefficiencies, it might not have enough fuel to reach its destination. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "The code quality suggests that this wasn't just a mistake. Some of these algorithms look like they were deliberately simplified to save development time." Marcus's face went pale. "Are you saying the subcontractor cut corners?" "I'm saying the code looks like it was written by someone who was more concerned with meeting a deadline than with getting it right," Gabe replied. "The logic is functional, but it's not robust. It's the kind of programming you do when you're under pressure to deliver something that works, not something that works well." The implications were staggering. If Apex Aviation Systems had deliberately delivered substandard software to meet contractual obligations, it could affect not just the silent wing, but potentially dozens of other aircraft projects. The aviation industry's reputation was built on safety and reliability, and any compromise in those areas could have catastrophic consequences. "We need to document everything," Celeste said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Every line of code, every diagnostic reading, every piece of evidence that suggests corner cutting." But Gabe was already thinking beyond the immediate problem. The fuel consumption issue was serious, but it was also fixable. The real question was whether Celeste and her team were willing to do what it would take to fix it properly. "I can write a temporary patch that will improve the fuel efficiency," he said. "It won't be perfect, but it should bring the consumption down to acceptable levels for the demonstration." "And after the demonstration?" Celeste asked. "After the demonstration, you'll need to decide whether you want to do this right or do it fast," Gabe replied, "because you can't do both." As he spoke, Gabe found himself thinking about his own choices, about the compromises he'd made and the prices he'd paid. The aircraft industry was built on the foundation of uncompromising standards, but the business world often demanded flexibility and speed. Finding the balance between those competing demands was one of the greatest challenges in modern aviation. "Show me what you can do," Celeste said, her voice carrying a note of determination that reminded Gabe of his father's quiet confidence. "If you can fix this, if you can make it right, then we'll find a way to make it work." Gabe nodded, already formulating a plan. The temporary patch would be relatively simply, few lines of code that would override the most problematic fuel mixture algorithms. But the real work would come later, when they had time to rebuild the environmental compensation systems from the ground up. "I'll need about 20 minutes, he said, his fingers already moving across the smartphone's screen. "And I'll need someone to monitor the engine parameters while I work." As he began typing, Gabe felt the familiar focus that came with challenging technical work. The code flowed from his fingers like music, each line building on the last, creating a digital solution to a very real problem. Around him, the crowd continued to celebrate the success of the engine startup, unaware of the deeper issues that still needed to be resolved. But Gabe knew that the real work was just beginning. Starting the engines had been the easy part. Making them work reliably, safely, and efficiently in the real world that would be the true test of his abilities and his commitment to the principles his father had taught him so many years ago. 20 minutes later, Gabe straightened up from his work, his back aching from bending over the smartphone screen. The improvised bleed airline he'd constructed from spare tubing and cable ties looked like something from a backyard mechanic shop, but it was doing exactly what it needed to do, providing a more stable pressure reference for the fuel management system. "The fuel consumption is down 8%, Sarah Kim announced, reading from the diagnostic display. "Still above optimal, but much closer to the design specifications." Gabe nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The desert sun was climbing higher, and the temperature on the tarmac was becoming uncomfortable. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the mental strain of debugging complex software while surrounded by cameras and crowds. "It's a band-aid solution," he said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd been fighting an uphill battle for hours. "The real fix will require completely rewriting the environmental compensation algorithms. But this should get you through the demonstration." As he spoke, Gabe found himself thinking about the deeper implications of what he'd discovered. The faulty code wasn't just a technical problem, it was a symptom of a culture that prioritized speed and cost savings over quality and safety. In the military, that kind of thinking could get people killed. In civilian aviation, the stakes were just as high. "Tell me about Apex Aviation Systems," he said to Marcus, who had been quietly observing the repairs. "How did they get the contract for this work?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "They submitted the lowest bid. The project was already over budget, and the board was looking for ways to cut costs without compromising performance." "And did they compromise performance?" Gabe asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not according to their test results," Marcus replied, but his tone suggested he had his own doubts. "Everything passed the acceptance tests. The code met all the specified requirements." Gabe almost smiled at the careful language. In the world of software development, meeting requirements was often very different from actually working well. A program could technically satisfy every specification while still being fundamentally flawed. "What about field testing?" he asked. "Did anyone actually fly this aircraft under real-world conditions?" "We did extensive flight testing," Marcus said, his voice defensive. "Hundreds of hours in all types of weather. With test pilots who knew about the limitations," Gabe said. "Pilots who could compensate for the system's quirks because they understood them. But what about normal operations? What about pilots who expect the aircraft to work the way it's supposed to?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. The aviation industry had learned, through decades of tragedy and investigation, that aircraft had to be designed for the worst-case scenario, the best-case scenario. A system that worked perfectly in the hands of expert test pilots could be a death trap for ordinary commercial pilots dealing with real-world pressures. "The environmental compensation algorithms are just the beginning," Gabe continued, his voice growing more serious. "If Apex cut corners on this code, what about the other systems? What about the navigation software, the autopilot, the emergency procedures?" Celeste had been listening to the conversation with growing concern. "Are you saying our entire avionics package could be compromised?" "I'm saying you need to audit everything," Gabe replied. "Every line of code, every algorithm, every system that Apex delivered. Because if they were willing to cut corners on something as critical as fuel management, they might have cut corners on other things too." The implications were staggering. A complete audit of the aircraft software could take months and cost millions of dollars. But the alternative, releasing an aircraft with potentially dangerous flaws, was unthinkable. "There's something else," Gabe said, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "The problems we're seeing aren't just about bad programming. They're about a fundamental misunderstanding of how aircraft systems work in the real world." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The military had taught him about systems thinking, about the way that individual components interacted to create emergent behaviors that couldn't be predicted from looking at the parts in isolation. But civilian contractors often worked in silos, focusing on their specific piece of the puzzle without considering the bigger picture. "Your hydrogen fuel cells are beautiful pieces of engineering," he continued. "Your electric motors are state-of-the-art. Your turbines are incredibly efficient. But the software that ties them all together was written by people who didn't understand how these systems interact under stress." As he spoke, Gabe was thinking about his own experiences with complex systems, both in the military and in his civilian life. The convoy attack that had ended his Air Force career had been caused by a single failed componenter radio that had stopped working at the worst possible moment. But the real tragedy had been the cascade of failures that followed, the way that one small problem had triggered a chain reaction that nobody had anticipated. "PTSD is like that too," he said, surprising himself by speaking the words aloud. One bad day, one traumatic event, and suddenly your entire nervous system is compromised. You can't trust your own reactions anymore. Marcus looked uncomfortable with the personal revelation, but Celeste was listening intently. "Is that what happened to you?" Gabe nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he remembered. "Afghanistan, roadside bomb. I was in the lead vehicle, and our radio failed just as we hit the IED. I couldn't call for backup, couldn't coordinate the rescue. People died because I couldn't do my job." "That wasn't your fault," Celeste said gently. "Wasn't it?" Gabe replied. "I was the communications specialist. My job was to make sure the radios worked. But I'd been pushing the equipment too hard, trying to extend its range beyond design specifications. When we needed it most, it failed." The parallel between his military experience and the current situation wasn't lost on him. In both cases, the failure had been caused by pushing systems beyond their intended limits, by expecting technology to compensate for human limitations. "The difference is that I learned from my mistakes," he continued. "I know what happens when systems fail under stress. I know how to design redundancy, how to plan for the worst-case scenario. But Apex didn't learn those lessons. They designed software for perfect conditions, and perfect conditions don't exist." As he spoke, Gabe was aware of the crowd around them, of the cameras still recording, of the weight of public attention. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful, something that mattered beyond his own survival. "The aircraft is safe to fly today," he said, his voice carrying the authority of professional judgment. "The patches I've installed will get you through the demonstration without any problems. But after that, you need to make a choice. You can continue with the flawed software and hope for the best, or you can do the hard work of fixing it properly." "What would you recommend?" Celeste asked. "I'd recommend starting over," Gabe replied. "Scrap the Apex software entirely and build new environmental compensation algorithms from scratch. It'll be expensive, it'll be time-consuming, and your investors won't like it. But it's the only way to ensure that this aircraft is truly safe for passenger service." The suggestion was radical, the kind of decision that could make or break a company. But Gabe had seen what happened when corners were cut, when safety was compromised for the sake of schedule and budget. The consequences were always worse than the original problem. "There's another option," he said, his voice quiet but determined. "You could hire people who understand these systems, people who've worked with complex aircraft under real-world conditions, people who know what it means when failure isn't an option." He paused, looking directly at Celeste. "You could hire people like me." The words hung in the air like a job application, a challenge, and a plea for redemption, all rolled into one. Gabe had nothing to lose and everything to gain. But more than that, he had something to offer: hard-won experience, battle-tested knowledge, and a perspective that couldn't be bought with any amount of money. "Veterans, displaced workers, people who've been written off by the system," he continued. "We understand failure because we've lived it. We know what it means to lose everything and start over, and we know the difference between doing things right and doing them fast." Around them, the crowd was beginning to disperse as the immediate excitement of the engine startup faded, but Gabe knew that the real work was just beginning. The aircraft was running, but it wasn't truly fixed. The deeper problems remained, waiting to surface at the worst possible moment. "What do you say?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of hope that surprised even him. "Are you willing to do this right?" The demonstration flight was flawless. The silent wing rose into the desert sky with the grace of a bird of prey, its hybrid engines producing a sound that was both powerful and eerily quiet. The hydrogen turbines provided the thrust for takeoff, while the electric motors took over for the whisper, quiet approach and landing. The performance specifications were met or exceeded in every category, and the assembled crowd of investors, journalists, and aviation enthusiasts erupted in applause as the aircraft touched down. But as Gabe watched from the tarmac, his attention was focused on the smartphone in his hands, which was still displaying the aircraft's diagnostic data. The fuel consumption numbers were better than they'd been that morning, but they were still troubling. More importantly, the patterns he was seeing suggested problems that went far deeper than simple software bugs. "Congratulations," Sarah Kim said, appearing at his elbow with a broad smile. "You just saved the company. The investors are ecstatic. The media is calling it a triumph, and our stock price is going through the roof." Gabe nodded absently, his attention still focused on the data streaming across the screen. "The flight performance was good," he agreed. "But look at these fuel efficiency curves. They're not consistent with the design specifications." Sarah frowned, leaning closer to examine the displays. "What do you mean?" "The aircraft is consuming too much fuel during certain phases of flight," Gabe explained, his finger tracing the irregular patterns on the screen. "The efficiency drops are too predictable, too systematic. It's like the software is programmed to waste fuel under specific conditions." "That's impossible," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Why would anyone program an aircraft to waste fuel?" Gabe was quiet for a moment, his mind working through the implications. In the military, he'd learned to recognize the signs of deliberate sabotage, the subtle patterns that distinguished intentional damage from accidental failure. What he was seeing now had some of those same characteristics. "Maybe they didn't program it to waste fuel," he said slowly. "Maybe they programmed it to appear more efficient than it actually is." The suggestion hung in the air like an accusation. But as Gabe continued to study the data, he became more convinced that his suspicions were correct. The fuel consumption patterns were too regular, too predictable to be the result of random programming errors. "I need to see the original source code," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Not just the compiled version that's running on the aircraft, but the actual programming that Apex delivered." "That's proprietary information," Sarah said, but she was already pulling out her phone. "I'd need authorization from Marcus or Ms. Keating." "Get it," Gabe said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Because if I'm right about this, your demonstration today was the least of your problems." 20 minutes later, Gabe was hunched over a laptop in the air-conditioned comfort of the engineering trailer, scrolling through thousands of lines of code. The Apex software was well documented and professionally formatted, but as he dug deeper into the algorithms, he began to see disturbing patterns. "There," he said, pointing to a section of code that controlled fuel mixture calculations. "Look at this subroutine. It's designed to optimize fuel efficiency during test conditions, but it degrades performance during normal operations." Marcus, who had been summoned to review the findings, studied the code with growing alarm. This is deliberate. The algorithm checks for specific test parameters and optimizes accordingly. But in real-world conditions, it falls back to a much less efficient mode. "It's worse than that," Gabe said, his voice grim. "Look at the timestamp on this code module. It was modified just 2 weeks before delivery. Someone at Apex made a conscious decision to program in this inefficiency." The implications were staggering. If the code had been deliberately modified to hide performance problems, it suggested a level of deception that went far beyond simple corner-cutting. It suggested fraud. "Why would they do this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because they were under pressure to deliver a product that met performance specifications," Gabe replied. "But they couldn't actually achieve those specifications within the time and budget constraints. So they programmed the software to cheat during testing." As he spoke, Gabe was thinking about the broader implications of what they'd discovered. The aviation industry was built on trust, on the assumption that manufacturers and suppliers would deliver exactly what they promised. If that trust was compromised, the entire system could collapse. "There's more," he said, opening another section of code. "Look at the emergency procedures. The algorithms for handling engine failures, fuel system malfunctions, critical system warnings, they're all simplified versions of what should be there." Marcus leaned closer, his face pale with growing realization. "They delivered minimum viable code, just enough to pass the acceptance tests, but not enough to handle real-world emergencies. Which means that in a crisis situation, the aircraft's automatic systems might not respond appropriately." Gabe continued, The pilots would be on their own, flying a machine that couldn't help them when they needed it most. The subcontractor's cost-cutting memo that Gabe had found buried in the code comments was damning evidence of deliberate negligence. It outlined a systematic approach to reducing development costs by delivering functionally adequate software, rather than the robust, comprehensive systems that had been specified in the contract. "Look at this," he said, highlighting a particularly damning section. "They call it acceptable risk mitigation. They knew the software was inadequate, but they calculated that the probability of encountering the specific failure modes was low enough to justify the cost savings." The memo was signed by Apex's Chief Technology Officer and dated just 3 months before the software delivery. It was clear evidence that the company's leadership had made a conscious decision to compromise safety for profit. "This is criminal," Celeste said, her voice shaking with anger. She'd been summoned to the trailer as soon as the extent of the problem became clear. "They've put passengers at risk to save money on development costs." "It's worse than that," Gabe replied. "According to this memo, they're using the same approach on other projects. Your aircraft might not be the only one affected." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled team. If Apex had been systematically delivering substandard software to multiple aircraft manufacturers, the implications for aviation safety were almost unthinkable. "We have to report this to the FAA," Marcus said, his voice hollow with the realization of what this meant for the Silent Wing project. "They'll have to ground all aircraft using Apex software until everything can be audited. And that will take months," Celeste added, her dreams of revolutionizing aviation crumbling around her. "Maybe years. By the time we're cleared to fly again, the competition will have passed us by." But Gabe was already thinking beyond the immediate crisis. The discovery of the fraudulent code was devastating, but it was also an opportunity. If they could prove that Kaew Aerospace was the victim of deliberate deception, they might be able to turn the situation to their advantage. "Not necessarily," he said, his voice carrying a note of determination. "What if we used this crisis to build something better? What if we took the lead in developing new standards for avionics software integrity?" The suggestion was radical, but it made sense. Instead of simply being another victim of Apex's deception, Kaew Aerospace could become the company that exposed the problem and led the industry's response to it. "We could establish a new division," Gabe continued, his mind racing with possibilities. "A team dedicated to developing ethical, transparent avionics software. We could hire veterans, displaced workers, people who understand the real-world consequences of system failures." He paused, looking directly at Celeste. "We could call it second-chance engineering. A place where people who've been written off by the system can prove their worth by building systems that actually work." The name resonated with everyone in the room. They had all been given a second chance that morning, Gabe, to prove his worth. Celeste to salvage her reputation, the entire company to demonstrate that they could overcome adversity. "It's ambitious," Celeste said, but there was excitement in her voice. "It would require significant investment, a complete restructuring of our development processes, and a level of transparency that most companies would find uncomfortable. But it's the right thing to do," Gabe replied, "and in the long run, it's the only thing that will work. The aviation industry can't continue to operate on the assumption that contractors will always deliver what they promise. We need better oversight, better standards, and better consequences for those who compromise safety." As he spoke, Gabe felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself. The discovery of the fraudulent code had been devastating, but it had also created an opportunity to build something better. "What do you say?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of hope. "Are you ready to change the industry?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, a promise, and a new beginning, all rolled into one. Outside, the desert sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new systems to build. But for the first time in years, Gabe felt ready to face them. The boardroom at Keating Aerospace headquarters was a monument to aviation history, its walls lined with photographs of legendary aircraft and the pioneers who had built them. Celeste's father smiled down from his portrait behind the head of the table, his weathered hands resting on the blueprints that had launched the company. But today, the atmosphere was anything but celebratory. Gabe sat at the polished mahogany table, acutely aware of how out of place he looked in his borrowed suit and hastily trimmed beard. 3 weeks had passed since the airshow demonstration, 3 weeks of intensive investigation, code review, and preparation for this moment. The second chance engineering proposal lay before him in a neat stack of documents, each page representing hours of work and years of hard-won experience. "The evidence is overwhelming," Celeste said, addressing the assembled board members and investors. Apex Aviation Systems deliberately delivered substandard software, compromising the safety and performance of our aircraft. But more than that, they've been doing the same thing to other manufacturers across the industry. The presentation slides on the wall showed the damning evidence they'd uncovered. Code comments that revealed deliberate corner-cutting, performance algorithms designed to cheat during testing, and emergency procedures that were inadequate for real-world scenarios. The subcontractors' internal memos painted a picture of systematic deception that had put countless passengers at risk. "The question before us today," Celeste continued, "is how we respond to this crisis. We can take the traditional approach, fire the subcontractor, hire a new one, and hope for the best. Or we can use this as an opportunity to fundamentally change how avionics software is developed and validated." Board member Patricia Hendricks, a former airline executive with 30 years of experience, leaned forward in her chair. "The liability implications alone are staggering. If we go public with this information, we'll be admitting that our aircraft has potentially dangerous flaws." "With respect, ma'am," Gabe interjected, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We're not admitting anything. We're the victims here. Apex defrauded us, just like they defrauded other manufacturers. The question is whether we're going to be passive victims or we're going to fight back." The presentation slides changed to show Gabe's proposal for the Second Chance Engineering Division. The concept was radical in its simplicity. Hire overlooked veterans and displaced workers to develop transparent, robust avionics software using open-source principles and rigorous testing protocols. "The aviation industry has always been built on the principle that safety comes first," Gabe continued, his confidence growing as he spoke. "But somewhere along the way, we've allowed cost pressures and schedule constraints to compromise that principle. The Second Chance Engineering Initiative would restore safety as the primary consideration in software development." Investment manager Robert Chen Marcus's uncle and a major shareholder studied the financial projections with obvious skepticism. "The development costs are enormous. We're talking about hiring 50 engineers, building new facilities, and essentially starting from scratch. The return on investment is questionable at best." "The return on investment is staying in business," Gabe replied, his military training evident in his direct manner. "Because if we don't fix this problem, if we don't restore confidence in our software, we won't have a business to worry about." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The aviation industry was built on trust, and that trust had been shattered by Apex's deception. Rebuilding it would require more than just fixing the immediate problems. It would require a fundamental commitment to transparency and accountability. "Tell us about the people you want to hire," Patricia said, her tone suggesting genuine interest rather than skepticism. Gabe's expression softened as he thought about the men and women he'd met during his years on the streets, veterans struggling with PTSD, displaced workers whose industries had disappeared, brilliant minds that had been written off by a society that measured worth in terms of current employment status. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez taught me aircraft maintenance 20 years ago," he said. "After he retired, he couldn't find work because employers thought he was too old to learn new technologies. But he understands aircraft systems better than anyone I've ever met. He knows what it means when failure isn't an option." The presentation slides showed profiles of potential team members: a former Navy electronics technician who'd become homeless after a medical bankruptcy, a displaced auto worker with a genius for troubleshooting complex systems, a retired Air Force pilot who'd been passed over for civilian positions because of her age. These people have been tested by adversity, Gabe continued. They know what it means to lose everything and start over. They understand the real-world consequences of system failures because they've lived them, and they're hungry to prove that they still have value, that they can still contribute. The business case was compelling, but Gabe knew that the real challenge was overcoming the cultural resistance to hiring people who didn't fit the traditional mold. The tech industry was notorious for its youth bias, its preference for recent graduates over experienced professionals who might be perceived as outdated. The software development methodology would be completely transparent, he explained, clicking to the next slide. All code would be open source, subject to independent review and verification. We'd establish rigorous testing protocols that go far beyond current industry standards, and we'd create a culture of accountability where safety always comes first. The proposal included detailed plans for training programs, mentorship opportunities, and career development paths that would help transitioning veterans and displaced workers adapt to the demands of modern software development. It was ambitious, expensive, and risky, but it was also exactly what the industry needed. The initial investment would be significant, Gabe acknowledged, but the long-term benefits go far beyond just our company. We'd be creating a new standard for the industry, establishing ourselves as the leader in ethical avionics development. That's worth more than any short-term cost savings. As he spoke, Gabe found himself thinking about his father, about the principles that had guided Eduardo Morales through decades of honest work. The old man had never compromised on quality, never cut corners to save money, never forgotten that his work affected real people's lives. "There's something else," Gabe said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "The people we're proposing to hire, they're not just skilled workers. They're people who've been discarded by the system, written off as obsolete or damaged, giving them a chance to contribute again, to prove their worth. That's not just good business. It's the right thing to do." The room was quiet as the board members digested the proposal. Gabe could see doubt in some faces, cautious interest in others, and in Celeste's eyes, a determination that reminded him of his father's unwavering commitment to excellence. "The FAA investigation is going to happen whether we want it or not," Celeste said, breaking the silence. "The question is whether we're going to be reactive or proactive. Are we going to wait for the regulators to impose new standards on us, or are we going to take the lead in developing those standards ourselves?" Board member Thomas Wright, a former Pentagon procurement officer, leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "The military has been dealing with contractor integrity issues for decades. The principles you're proposing, transparency, accountability, rigorous testing, they're not new. What's new is applying them to civilian aviation, which is exactly what we need to do," Gabe replied. "The military learned these lessons the hard way, through failures that cost lives. The civilian aviation industry shouldn't have to repeat those mistakes." The presentation concluded with a timeline for implementation, showing how the Second Chance Engineering Division could be operational within 6 months. The initial focus would be on rewriting the Silent Wings avionics software, but the long-term vision was much broader, establishing new industry standards for software integrity and creating a model that other manufacturers could follow. "The bottom line," Gabe said, standing up to address the room directly, "is that we have a choice. We can continue with business as usual, hoping that the next contractor will be more honest than the last one. Or we can take control of our own destiny, building the kind of software that we would trust our own families to fly with." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a promise, and a new beginning, all rolled into one. Around the table, the board members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from skepticism to cautious optimism. Patricia Hendricks was the first to speak. "The proposal is ambitious, certainly, But given the alternative continued dependence on contractors who've already proven they can't be trusted, makes sense. The financial projections are sound, Robert Chen added grudgingly. The initial investment is substantial, but the long-term return could be significant if we can establish ourselves as the industry leader in software integrity. One by one, the board members voiced their opinions, their questions, their concerns. The debate was thorough, sometimes heated, but gradually a consensus began to emerge. The Second Chance Engineering Initiative wasn't just a response to the current crisis, it was an opportunity to reshape the entire industry. All in favor? Celeste asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision they were about to make. The hands went up around the table, some quickly, others more slowly, but eventually all of them. The vote was unanimous. Motion carried, Celeste announced, her voice carrying a note of triumph. The Second Chance Engineering Division is officially authorized. As the board members filed out of the room, discussing implementation details and logistical challenges, Gabe remained at the table, staring at the portrait of Celeste's father. The old man's eyes seemed to hold a spark of approval, a recognition that his daughter had chosen the harder path but the right one. "Thank you," Celeste said, approaching him as the room emptied. "For everything. For fixing the aircraft, for exposing the fraud, for showing us a better way forward." "Thank you for giving me the chance," Gabe replied. 3 weeks ago, I was just another homeless veteran. Today, I'm the head of a new engineering division. That doesn't happen without people willing to take risks on damaged goods." "You're not damaged goods," Celeste said firmly. "You're exactly what we needed, someone who understands the real-world consequences of failure, someone who won't compromise on safety, someone who believes that second chances matter." As they walked out of the boardroom together, Gabe felt something he hadn't experienced in yearshope, not just for himself, but for all the people who'd been written off, discarded, forgotten. The Second Chance Engineering Initiative was more than just a business venture, it was proof that everyone deserved another opportunity to prove their worth. The real work was just beginning. The boardroom presentation slides glowed against the wall, their clean lines and professional graphics, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Gabe stood at the head of the table, his hands steady now as he faced the assembled investors and executives. The borrowed suit had been replaced by clothing that actually fit, but more importantly, the tremor of anxiety that had plagued him for years was finally under control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "What you're looking at is more than just a business proposal. It's a roadmap for rebuilding trust in an industry that has forgotten what integrity means." The slides showed the results of their investigation into Apex Aviation Systems, a pattern of deception that extended far beyond the Silent Wing project. The subcontractor had been cutting corners on aircraft software for over a dozen manufacturers, creating a web of compromised systems that threatened the safety of millions of passengers. "The evidence is undeniable," Celeste added, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were revealing. Apex has been systematically delivering substandard software, optimizing for cost savings rather than safety. But more than that, they've been actively concealing these compromises from their clients. Investment banker David Morrison leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "These are serious allegations. Do you have legal proof of deliberate fraud?" Gabe clicked to the next slide, revealing the damning internal memos they'd uncovered. These documents were found in Apex's own code repositories. They show a deliberate strategy to reduce development costs by delivering functionally adequate software rather than the robust systems specified in their contracts. The memos were devastating in their clarity. Apex executives had calculated that the risk of catastrophic failure was low enough to justify the cost savings from simplified software. They had deliberately chosen to compromise safety for profit, gambling with the lives of innocent passengers. "The implications extend far beyond our company," Gabe continued. "According to our analysis, Apex software is running on aircraft operated by 7 major airlines, 3 cargo carriers, and numerous corporate flight departments. We're talking about potentially thousands of aircraft with compromised safety systems. The room fell silent as the full scope of the crisis became clear. This wasn't just about one company's reputation, it was about the integrity of the entire aviation industry. If word of this got out prematurely, it could cause a panic that would ground flights worldwide. "What's your proposed solution?" asked Patricia Hendricks, her airline experience making her acutely aware of the operational implications. "We go public," Gabe replied, his voice firm. "We present our findings to the FAA, to the aviation press, and to the public. We show them that Keating Aerospace was a victim of this fraud, but more importantly, we show them how we're going to fix it." The boardroom presentation slides shifted to show detailed plans for the Second Chance Engineering Initiative. The proposal was comprehensive, covering everything from recruiting strategies to quality assurance protocols. But at its heart was a simple principle: hire people who understood the real-world consequences of system failures. The veteran employment contracts represent more than just job creation, Gabe explained, his voice taking on a more personal tone. They represent a commitment to bringing wisdom and experience back into an industry that has become too focused on youth and innovation at the expense of reliability and safety. The first contracts were ready for signature, representing the initial hiring of 12 veterans and displaced workers. Each one had been carefully selected for their combination of technical skills and real-world experience. Master Sergeant Rodriguez would lead the hydraulics team, drawing on 30 years of keeping military aircraft airborne. Former Navy electronics technician Sarah Martinez would oversee the electrical systems group, her expertise in shipboard electronics translating perfectly to aircraft applications. "These aren't charity hires," Gabe emphasized. "These are highly skilled professionals who've been overlooked by an industry that values credentials over capability. They understand that when software fails, people die. That's not an abstract concept to Themits, a lived reality." Robert Chen studied the financial projections with obvious concern. "The development costs are enormous. We're talking about completely rebuilding our software infrastructure from the ground up. The timeline alone will put us months behind our competitors." "Our competitors are flying aircraft with compromised software," Gabe replied. "When the FAA investigation concludes, when the extent of Apex's fraud becomes public, those companies will face massive liability issues. We'll be the ones who identified the problem and took action to fix it." The strategic advantage was clear, but it required courage to seize it. Going public with the fraud allegations would make Keating Aerospace a target for Apex's legal team and potentially expose the company to lawsuits from affected airlines. But it was also the only way to differentiate themselves from the competition and establish themselves as the industry leader in software integrity. "The transparency protocols we're proposing are unprecedented," Celeste added, clicking to the next slide. "All source code will be open to independent review. Testing procedures will be documented and verifiable. We'll establish a culture where safety concerns can be raised without fear of retaliation." The presentation showed detailed workflows for software development, testing, and validation. Every line of code would be subject to peer review. Every algorithm would be tested under conditions that exceeded normal operational parameters. And every system would be validated by people who had personally experienced the consequences of failure. "The key difference," Gabe explained, "is that we're not just building software, we're building accountability. When a veteran who's seen combat writes code for an emergency landing system, they're not thinking about meeting deadlines or cutting costs. They're thinking about the pilot who might have to use that system to save lives." The presentation concluded with a direct challenge to the board. They could continue with business as usual, hoping that the next contractor would be more honest than Apex, or they could take the lead in establishing new industry standards for software integrity. "The choice is simple," Gabe said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "We can be victims of this fraud, or we can be the company that exposes it and shows the industry a better way forward. The boardroom fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about fixing a technical problem, it was about fundamentally changing how the aviation industry approached software development. The stakes were enormous, the risks were significant, and the potential rewards were transformative. "Motion to approve the Second Chance Engineering Initiative," Patricia Hendricks said, her voice cutting through the silence. "All in favor?" The hands went up around the table, some quickly, others more slowly, but eventually all of them. The vote was unanimous, and with it, the aviation industry was about to change forever. 6 months later, Gabe stood in the same spot where he'd once watched from behind a chain-link fence, but now the view was entirely different. The Second Chance Engineering facility stretched across the desert floor, its modern buildings housing teams of engineers, programmers, and technicians who had all been given the opportunity to prove their worth. The morning sun glinted off the ID badge, clipped to his shirt, a simple piece of plastic that represented far more than just access to a building. Gabriel Morales, Director of Engineering, Second Chance Aviation Solutions. The title still felt surreal, but the responsibility felt right. Every day, he walked through offices filled with people who had been written off by the system, who had been deemed too old, too damaged, or too obsolete to contribute. Now they were building the future of aviation safety. "The FAA audit results came in this morning," Sarah Kim announced, approaching with a tablet, displaying the official report. She'd been promoted to lead the software validation team, her youth balanced by the wisdom of the veterans she worked alongside. Perfect score across all categories. "They're calling our transparency protocols the new industry standard." Gabe smiled, remembering the anxiety that had once made his hands shake whenever he faced official scrutiny. Now, he welcomed it. The Second Chance Engineering Division had nothing to hide there. Code was open source, their testing procedures were documented, and their commitment to safety was unwavering. "How's Rodriguez doing with the new hydraulics team?" he asked, watching through the window as the Master Sergeant demonstrated proper troubleshooting techniques to a group of recently hired engineers. "He's in his element," Sarah replied. "Yesterday he told me that teaching these young folks is the most important work he's ever done. Says he's finally passing on everything he learned in 30 years of keeping aircraft airborne." The success stories were everywhere. Former Navy electronics technician Sarah Martinez had been promoted to lead the electrical systems group, her expertise in shipboard electronics proving invaluable in developing robust aircraft systems. Displaced auto worker Miguel Santos had become the team's expert in sensor integration, his experience with manufacturing tolerances, helping them design systems that could handle real-world variations. "The Boeing order came through," Celeste said, joining them at the window. "They want to retrofit their entire 787 fleet with our new software. The contract is worth $200 million, but more importantly, it validates everything we've been working toward." The transformation of Keating Aerospace had been remarkable. What had started as a response to fraud had become a movement that was reshaping the industry. Other manufacturers were adopting similar transparency protocols. Regulators were updating their oversight procedures. And a new generation of engineers was learning that safety was more important than speed or cost savings. "There's something else," Celeste continued, her voice carrying a note of excitement. "The Veterans Administration wants to partner with us on a nationwide program. They're calling it the Second Chance Initiative, and they want to replicate our model in other industries." Gabe felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with personal achievement. The principle they'd established that experience and wisdom were more valuable than credentials and youth was spreading beyond aviation. Across the country, companies were beginning to realize that the people they'd discarded might be exactly the people they needed to solve their most challenging problems. "The new ID badges came in," Sarah said, handing him a box of freshly printed credentials. Each one bore the Second Chance Engineering logo, a phoenix rising from the ashes, symbolizing rebirth and renewal. But more importantly, each one represented a life that had been transformed, a career that had been resurrected, a second chance that had been earned. As Gabe distributed the badges to his team, he thought about the journey that had brought them all here. 3 months ago, most of these people had been struggling to survive on the margins of society. Now they were building systems that would protect millions of passengers, proving that worth wasn't measured by current circumstances, but by character and capability. "You know what I realized?" Master Sergeant Rodriguez said, accepting his new badge with weathered hands that had maintained aircraft for 3 decades. "All those years I thought I was just fixing machines, but I was really learning how to fix problems, any problems. The machines were just practice." The insight resonated through the group. Every person in the Second Chance Engineering Division had been tested by adversity, had learned to solve problems under pressure, had discovered that failure was just another word for learning opportunity. Those hard-won lessons were now being applied to create the safest, most reliable aircraft software in the industry. "The first production aircraft with our new software suite is ready for delivery," Gabe announced, looking out at the gleaming jet on the tarmac. "Every line of code has been reviewed by people who understand the real-world consequences of system failures. Every algorithm has been tested by engineers who know that cutting corners isn't just bad business, it's a betrayal of trust." The aircraft represented more than just technological achievement. It represented the validation of a principle that society had forgotten, that the people who had been knocked down by life might be the ones with the most to offer. The veterans who had seen combat understood the importance of reliable systems. The displaced workers who had lost their jobs understood the value of quality work. The homeless individuals who had been invisible to society understood the importance of being seen and valued. "There's a memorial service next week," Celeste said quietly, "for the passengers who died in the crashes caused by Apex's faulty software. The families have asked us to attend, to represent the people who exposed the fraud and made sure it couldn't happen again." The weight of responsibility settled on Gabe's shoulders, but it was a weight he was ready to bear. The Second Chance Engineering Initiative had started as a response to technical problems, but it had become something much more importante, statement about the value of human dignity, the power of redemption, and the importance of second chances. "We'll be there," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for the forgotten. "Because this isn't just about fixing software. It's about honoring the people who were hurt by the system we're trying to change." As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, the team returned to their work. There were algorithms to debug, systems to test, and safety protocols to validate. But there was also something more intangible, a sense of purpose that came from knowing that their work mattered, that their experience had value, that their second chance was making a difference. Gabe's new ID badge caught the sunlight as he walked through the facility, its simple design representing something profound, the recognition that worth wasn't determined by circumstances but by character, that the people society discarded might be exactly the people it needed most, and that everyone deserved the chance to prove their value. The homeless veteran who had watched from behind a fence was gone, replaced by a leader who understood that true altitude wasn't measured in feet above sea level, but in the courage to lift others up. The aircraft they were building would carry passengers safely to their destinations, but more importantly, the principles they were establishing would carry the industry toward a future where safety, integrity, and human dignity were valued above all else. Sometimes the most brilliant minds did sleep on park benches, invisible to a world that measured worth by bank accounts and business suits. But sometimes, if they were lucky, someone would see their potential and give them the chance to prove that second chances were worth taking. The work continued, the aircraft flew, and the future looked brighter than it had in years. In the end, that was what second chances were all about. Not just the opportunity to start over, but the possibility of building something better than what came before.